Well, hello and welcome everybody. This is a Grab the Mic webinar hosted by the Beam Exchange, providing a space for practitioners of market systems development to share knowledge and experience. Today, we are delighted to introduce 4 speakers from Swisscontact and the Palladium group. They're going to talk about the application of the market systems approach to work with refugees, and particularly their refugee livelihoods and economic inclusion, with examples from Uganda, Nigeria, and Kenya. The first speaker will be Debora Randall. She's an independent market systems consultant working with Swisscontact and Palladium on the 3 projects that we're going to hear about today. Now, I just want to say quickly that the application of market systems development to the challenges facing refugees is a very hot topic. In fact, there was a very interesting report published in the last couple of days by Mercy Corps, a short briefing, and you'll find a copy of that on the webinar page along with the webinar recording later this week. But for those of us who work in market systems development, it's very exciting to see these ideas that we've been using for 10 or 15 years beginning to have an influence in other sectors, and particularly in the humanitarian sector and amongst people concerned. Okay, I have assigned a control to you, so if you're struggling, I will just forward the slides on your behalf.
Okay. Thanks.
There may be a small delay.
Yeah. There we go. Okay. All right. So yeah, we're looking at what we're going to look about today is we're going to be looking at how market systems are being applied with refugees and IDPs using the market systems approach. Essentially, just quickly, an overview of what we're going to be talking today. We're going to look at the case for market systems. And then we're going to look at 3 different projects: Northern Uganda, Northern Nigeria, and Northern Kenya. And then we're going to have some time for your questions and comments at the end. So what is the case for market systems? Well, we know just statistics by UNHCR that by the end of 2015, about 65 million people had been displaced as a result of, a number of different things: conflict, violence, human rights violations. And of these, 21 million were refugees, and 40.8 million were IDPs, and about 3.2 million asylum seekers. So really what we're looking at here is, the scale, and, this is really a quote from UNHCR, the scale and complexity of the challenge of responding to refugees and other displaced peoples has increased, and displacement persists over time. So I just wanted to initially talk about those 3 words: scale, complexity, and over time. So basically, we're looking at the scale of the situation and how market systems approach can be useful in that, because of the scale of what we're dealing with, we actually need to be looking systemically. So no longer can we be just looking at, 3,000 refugees, 4,000 refugees, 5,000 refugees, and linking them with economic development or skills development, because the numbers are just that much bigger. I mean, in the context where the project I'm on in NU-TEC is, we've got 1 million South Sudanese refugees that have come in the last year and a half. And, we can't just focus on those small elements, so we need to look systemically. The other thing is market systems can help us adapt. We know the context is constantly changing, it's adapting, and so we need to use adaptive management. So the market system approach can help in that. And also, the market system approach allows us to analyze and look at a number of different systems. For instance, the aid system. The aid system perpetuates dependency in handouts, and there's a number of reasons why that happens: procurement, a number of different things. So we actually can look at a number of different systems, not just like a commodity or a skills system. We can also look at the aid system. So that helps us analyze different systems and look at actual change. And secondly, the complexity. I alluded that a little bit. There's such complexity with the refugees and IDPs. Not only do we have the displaced peoples, we have host communities, and we have the whole aid machine also that's in there. So governments and a constant changing dynamic. So it's very, very complex. And we need to be able to have strong analytical skills to understand the different influencers and identify core problems so that we can be adjusting and adapting with each of these changes. So again, a market systems approach allows for that. And then the third thing just initially is over time. We know that basically that, for instance, in East Africa, the average length of time that a refugee is actually remain in their host communities is 18 years. We've got IDPs in Uganda, in northern Uganda, who were in camps for up to 30 years. And so there's just a longer amount of time that people are in displaced. And so we need to be not thinking of this as such an acute crisis situation. And so we're talking here really around protracted relief situations. Markets, we know markets are key for long-term development, ensuring food security and getting sustainable livelihoods. Again, a market system approach can help with that. So we need to be really thinking long-term from the beginning. And this is really aligned with the new Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, which was just developed by the UN last year in 2016. And they're really recognizing that we can no longer think about these protracted relief situations with refugees and IDPs as humanitarian only. We need to actually have a shift, and they're calling for working with the host community and bringing in the private sector from the beginning. So again, all these types of things, the market systems approach can actually help us respond to. And yeah, this slide here, economic opportunities are market-based. They need to be market-based. I mean, I think many of us have been in situations in settlements or camps or where we've seen, the multitude of, skills training programs trying to get women trained up with dressmaking, with sewing machines, and just people just not being able to actually get work because of that. We need to actually make sure from the beginning that there's real solutions that are market-based for refugees or IDPs. And again, a market system approach can do this because it's working with the private sector and bringing the private sector in from the beginning. So how do we do this? We're exploring a number of different ideas around push-pull factors. I just wanted to make a mention of this. Collins will talk about this in more detail in his presentation. But basically because of the different capacities of refugees, it's really critical to have this dual approach of building refugees' asset base, getting their skills up to market-based approaches, but also bringing the private sector in from the beginning. Because initially we used to do that before. We used to build the asset base and then hope that the market would work out, or maybe work with the market later on 5 years down the road. Now we're saying we need to bring the market actors in immediately, and therefore a key way of doing that, if refugees, let's say a large number of refugees aren't necessarily ready for markets, for getting pushed up to the market, is working with host communities as well can be a great way of building a commercial case to get market actors in. So there's a combination of these push and pull factors. So pulling people into the market by working directly with the market actors, which is more a traditional M4P market systems approach, and then actually preparing displaced peoples or refugees for the market. And then finally, just wanted to look at, we see that it's critical to involve the private sector, obviously, because of the opportunities, because of efficiencies in rebuilding people's livelihoods. We need to, and again, a market systems approach can help us in that. There are great opportunities for the private sector to get involved, for instance, on distribution of food. We know WFP prefers cash because it's just more actually efficient for them. Local traders, market actors distribute food a lot better than WFP can. agricultural inputs and other supplies, there are market actors there, or market actors that would move into those areas if there was a case for them to do so. There are lots of opportunities, and this can facilitate a return to a functioning market system, or in the case of northern Uganda, where I'm mostly focused, it's actually starting a market system, because actually traditionally, historically within the West Nile area where most of the refugees are, it's a very undeveloped area. There's only about 2.4 million people as population, and that has increased by 1 million people in the last 18 months. So there's lots of new opportunities and new markets with these new populations, and also additional investments can be leveraged, like infrastructure. A lot of money is going into building roads in those areas, so it's opening up the trading routes into those areas. So there are lots of great opportunities, but on the other hand, it's a very, very challenging context, lots of handouts. We found it quite challenging. How do we get agri-dealers to sell seeds to refugees and host community farmers when refugees are being handed out and given 100% subsidy, and then many turning around and selling the seeds for cheaper to host community members than what an agri-dealer can sell for? So quite a challenging context to work in. Also, you end up with some other organizations who will give these very large subsidies to market actors. There's that happens all the time, where you get $500,000, $1 million going into these market actors. And so us as adopting a market systems approach, where we're more catalytic and trying to get more efficient systems with smaller amounts of money, it can be quite difficult for us to work in that distorted market. And also, I think another challenge is that the larger companies, for instance, we found the seed companies struggle it's harder for them to have a case to invest when you're working in a smaller project like 5,000 people. They need a bigger case, like 20,000 or 30,000, to actually justify their involvement. So it's really working within that challenging context. So I'm going to stop there and pass the mic over to Apuoyo, who's the team leader on the NU-TEC project, and he's going to talk a little bit more specifically about northern Uganda and the work we're doing there.
Thank you very much, Debora, and hello everyone. I'm Apuoyo. I'm going to take you very quickly through what we do in northern Uganda. A very quick glance at what NU-TEC is all about. We are a DFID-funded program. We are an agribusiness development program working with the private sector in northern Uganda to impact 75,000 people or more, households in northern Uganda. We use a market system approach, and so far we work in a number of value chains within northern Uganda. Around mid last year, DFID requested NU-TEC to allocate 25% of its resources to try and address the crisis that was emerging in northern Uganda. The influx of refugees was so massive, and it was impacting on the area where the NU-TEC program as a whole is focusing on. And the inflow alone was substantive enough to actually impact on even some of the private sector partners we were working with. Hence, there was no way we could ignore the situation. So we were asked to do something about the refugee crisis using some of the resources we have. When we went in, we started with a very basic theory of change, that if you identify and define business opportunities, private sector will invest in those opportunities, and especially if there are opportunities around agricultural inputs and buying and selling of agricultural produce. If that were to happen, then we thought that the households within the refugee hosting areas and the refugees themselves would then get involved in production for surplus for the market. and that will attract private sector to go in and buy from them, with the impact that that would then allow these refugees to find some level of economic empowerment. So that was the basic theory of change we started with. We didn't know what we were going into, and therefore we didn't want to make it too complicated. So we designed an intervention that was going to look at how we can influence the private sector to go into the refugee hosting areas with seeds and other agricultural inputs for sale to the households, both host and refugee households. We made sure that we did sufficient market analysis to highlight the opportunities that existed there. And that was actually the key, highlighting the opportunities, showing the private sector that they can actually make money based on clear analysis of the opportunity. We also looked at how technology could be involved in this. How do you use ICT to enhance transaction or to enhance delivery of services? We also saw an opportunity to use promotional campaigns to drive demand for the inputs that we were interested in. Then we worked with the private sector to build the infrastructure that would enable them not only to distribute the inputs, but also to buy off any production. Then we also looked at a key aspect that would actually drive commercialization, and that was around how to provide timely tractor services to support farm expansion and also to enable the households to prepare their farms in time, given the erratic nature of the climate in the hosting areas. With those, we thought that would enable the private sector to change their way of working and hence increase their operations in that area, opening more opportunities to the host households and the refugee households. The intervention we are doing in this refugee region is actually a partnership with Mexico. We recognize that there are some refugee households that would require a lot of input in terms of training, awareness creation, and even mobilization. And that kind of work, as many of you will appreciate, does not fit very well within the M4P approach. And that is where we thought partnering with an organization with experience to do that would work out very well. Palladium, on the other hand, then focused on mobilizing the private sector, identifying the opportunities for them to work in, and making sure that they have the infrastructure to enable them link with the households that were productive in the refugee hosting areas. Next. So we made this to work concurrently rather than to say that Mexico starts first and Palladium next. No, we decided we are going in all together, working at the same time, and hoping that we can identify households that were enterprising enough, both from the refugees and from the host communities, to take forward. So, many of you know that refugees are always allocated to areas that are normally disconnected from markets. Whether you talk of refugees in northern Kenya or northern Nigeria or northern Uganda, one thing is common. Areas where they end up settling in tend to be already underdeveloped even before they arrived there. Markets are highly distorted due to emergency operations, and then markets are thin because cash is not available. So we set out with 3 hypotheses when we were setting off. We said, first, within these areas, there are enterprising refugee and host community households that are able to invest in productive activities. Secondly, we said if private sector can identify a viable market, they are likely to invest. Then thirdly, we said refugees and host community areas can actually produce surplus. And when they produce surplus, they can attract a private sector. You can see we have managed in the short period to reach 2,200 households. We have managed to get a local private sector and even regional private sector to go in there, and we have been able to generate business amounting to almost £230,000 in about 7 months. What have we come across that is really exciting is that refugees can and host communities can actually invest. They just need to know that whatever they are investing in is going to give them a return. We also realize that it is easier to attract smaller local private sector than the bigger ones. Debora talked about that earlier on. But I wanted to mention something that is really important in designing this kind of projects, is the fact that we need to recognize right from the beginning that it is critical to understand that these areas are distorted, and as a market development program, you will face that challenge and design your project program accordingly. It is also critical to understand that there is a lot of competition from subsidized handouts, and you are better off avoiding an area that is crowded with handouts. So pick products or pick business lines that are not heavily crowded by handouts. Just to go towards finalizing, I think I picked 3 implications for any programming. The private sector can engage innovatively. What needs to be done is to try and make sure that we, as programs, define very innovative risk-sharing mechanisms, which we have done in our program. If there is a clear profit signal, private sector will invest in refugee areas. There is opportunity for us as programs to actually utilize the resources we have creatively to crowd in the private sector. I think in our case, we have used vouchers, we have used ICT in a way, and we have used a risk-sharing system that enables the private sector to take the risk. Commercial relationships between refugees and the private sector will emerge if there is a win-win between them. Already we are seeing the local host community renting out land to the refugees, and the refugees actually looking for additional land within their host communities. We need to build on that rather than create completely new markets that we are thinking of and not required by the refugees and the host. Then lastly, involving the local authority is critical. They are very important in making decisions what work in this area. So you cannot work outside them. Work with them, fit in their framework, and chances of success are high. It is still early days to say this is a success, but we are seeing good indications of success. I stop there and pass on to my colleague, Peter Douglas, who is a manager within the economic growth practice at Palladium. He's also the technical manager of Propcom Mai-Karfi in Nigeria. Peter, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Collins. Right, let me move these slides on. Excellent. So the Propcom Mai-Karfi program is similar to sort of the initial activities that NU-TEC took on. It's an agricultural and rural market systems program in Nigeria. It's been running for 2 phases over 9 years, and this most recent phase, which is just in its final months, has benefited over I think well over 600,000 smallholders and rural entrepreneurs designing and delivering interventions in a number of agricultural and rural markets, including fertilizer, livestock, maize, and cross-cutting sectors, for example, infrastructure, logistics, and so on. Now, the context for Propcom Mai-Karfi is that it's going into its final phase, and this phase has been tasked with the mandate of engaging in the northeast of Nigeria, so in Borno, Yobe, Adamawa, and the neighboring states, which have been impacted by the conflict with Boko Haram, but also the resulting crisis that has ensued. I think at this point we're looking at around 5.8 million people considered in need of food assistance in the region, 3.7 million facing acute malnutrition, and I think in terms of the number of displaced individuals, the current stat by UNHCR is about 1.7 million. So the program is moving from a conventional mandate around building, facilitating inclusive market growth in agricultural market systems to actually engaging in a scenario which is much more like market recovery. And I think in that sense, Propcom differs from NU-TEC in that what NU-TEC is looking at is it's looking at the communities which are housing refugees from South Sudan, and it's actually looking at these areas which may not be temporary, as Debora had said, but are the communities which refugees have moved to. I think as Propcom, what we're looking at is less engaging in areas where IDPs are currently residing, but we are working in the areas which IDPs are returning to. So what we're looking at in northeast Nigeria is still a significant number of displaced individuals, but actually a much greater population in the states that have been affected by the crisis, that have either stayed or are now returning, and now are experiencing acute crisis, but also a situation which you could describe as protracted relief. So what Propcom is looking to do is rather than just build and develop inclusive markets, is actually looking at as a transition process, using the market systems approach to transition from a situation of crisis-affected markets receiving humanitarian relief to actually being recovered markets which are fully functional. And at the top of this slide, you can see a sort of pathway of a crisis and the type of engagement that is required. So you've got that initial acute crisis or shock, which requires an emergency response. You would then move to the resulting impact of that shock, so crisis-affected markets and communities. And at this stage, you move to a protracted relief scenario. And what Propcom is mandated to do is to explore and try and see some form of market transition or recovery as you move away from humanitarian relief dependent markets to fully functional markets. Now, NU-TEC, as well as being different in terms of the locations they're operating, is also further down the line than Propcom. Propcom is about to begin the inception phase, if you will, for the next stage, and so we are just beginning to do analysis. So in that sense, we don't have a huge amount of learning in terms of delivery, but I do want to share a little bit conceptually around how we're preparing the inception phase to consider the theory of change, but also to start developing those pilot interventions that we can carry forward. So the approach we're using is a market systems approach, but is really broken down into these three areas. We want to undertake actor-based mapping and understand all of the actors that are operating in the market and the relationships between them. And as Debora said, this includes actually incorporating humanitarian relief actors and other NGOs in those market systems. The next step is looking at a change agenda, realizing that there needs to be a shift from what's currently happening and those current relationships to a future state, which in this case is a recovered functioning market system. The third one there is what Palladium would call causal impact pathways. So once we've identified the current and future state, we then think we need to then work out what behavior change individual actors need to take, which will then result in wider changes in the system. And so this is what will inform intervention design and delivery, and will also play into our MRM system and adaptive management system and so on. Okay, so we've jumped around, but I think we are at the right slide now. So what I wanted to give you is just a brief insight into the type of market mapping that we're currently doing. Because what we realize is that in the protracted relief environment, the market system looks hugely different. So what we've got here is a slide that just conveys the standard actors in a functioning agricultural market, both private and public sector. And you can see the classic provision of goods and services by the private sector, whether it's inputs, storage, logistics services, finance, market information, and then you've got the public sector, which are regulating that, providing infrastructure and developing policy that informs how these actors engage. And what we've seen in northeast Nigeria is a very different situation. Let's see if it's going to move on for me. Yeah, okay. So what you can see there is all of the private sector has left. When we were doing our market analysis in Borno and Yobe in particular, what we saw is that the conflict had ultimately chased most of the private sector away, whether it was fear of a loss of assets, an inability to do bank transfers or to trade. What it's essentially meant is that either in the case of agricultural production, it stops altogether, or in the case of trading, buying and selling, just people have moved elsewhere where the risks are reduced. And in that scenario, the impact is huge. You have a huge reduction in food production, access from food through trade, and you have a food insecure situation. And as a result, relief agencies and the public sector step in to fill those roles, providing food, but also as IDPs are returning, providing the seeds, other inputs, finance, infrastructure that is required to enable IDPs to start farming again. There is engagement by the public sector, but again, depending on the nature of the protracted relief environment, the public sector are probably playing a very different role to what they would in a functioning market, and they would certainly see more than ever the provision of previously private sector provided goods and services as a public good, and there's often a lot of politics around that. Is the government, whether it's federal or municipal, is it supporting returning IDPs? Is it supporting local communities? So in that scenario, what can a market systems program do? I think if you go back to the idea of current and future state, the objective is to actually support, where appropriate, the actors to be playing a role that they previously would in a functioning market system. So here we have this idea of current state and end state. And I think it's worth noting here that as we've engaged with INGOs and others, there is a huge aversion to risk of moving this process forward before its time. So there's a causality discussion here as to whether you engaging with the private sector to encourage them to re-enter is what will support the market system to function, or whether actually you need to do assessments to check whether it's appropriate for them to start changing their behavior. And this is where PropCom is. We are doing market feasibility assessments, looking at the risk that relates to market actors operating in those areas. Is it safe? Is it stable? Then looking at the feasibility of economic transactions, and then once we're there, then we can look at how we can encourage the private sector to return, but also for the humanitarian relief agencies to change their practice to draw back in the private sector. And I think something that we see a lot is that relief agencies continue providing goods and services to crisis-affected communities beyond the point that they need to, and that hinders the private sector to return. And so a lot of what PropCom is beginning to do as we develop pilot interventions is to work with relief agencies, whether it's the FAO, whether it's ICRC and others, to work out how we can help relief agencies move from direct provision of goods and services to something where the private sector are more involved. So that's, in short, where Propcom Mai-Karfi is, and really keen to answer any questions about where we are. We certainly haven't been doing a lot of delivery yet, but we are at that beginning stage of working out how on earth do we move a market systems program into an area of protracted relief with an aim of facilitating market recovery. So I'm going to pass over to Ailsa, who is the Swisscontact Head of Inclusive Growth in Eastern, Central and Southern Africa.
Great, thanks Peter. So I'm going to be talking to you about Swisscontact's Skills for Life project, which works in Kakuma, which is in northern Kenya, and we work with both refugees and host communities. We've moved out of our pilot phase, we're in implementation, but I'd certainly like to put this into context for you. Now, this camp in Kakuma itself has been in existence for over 20 years. It hosts about 2,000 people currently, 200,000 people, sorry, and it's one of the largest camps in the world. On the other hand, Kakuma town, which was a very small town in the early 90s of about 8,000 people, is still only about 100,000 people, so half the amount of people in the local town than there is in the camp. So you can imagine there are more people and many more businesses in the camp than there are in the local town. So as a consequence, we've got lots of agencies that have been working in this space for a long time. But as has been mentioned earlier, I think there's been kind of overall reductions in funding, and this has kind of meant there's a lot more pressure for refugees to obtain their needs from local markets. And this kind of push by UNHCR that Debora mentioned earlier to look for more solutions that can influence the choices that refugees make at the moment and in the future. And this extends to the host communities as well, as many interventions like ours also support local populations. So where we are is that this means that there's many donors and implementing agencies that are much more open to these market approaches that we're trying to influence. Now, Swisscontact as an organisation, we don't traditionally work in this humanitarian space, whereas Swiss Foundation, we work in development. So it's a relatively new space for us, especially here in East Africa. But in this project, as in all our projects globally, we are working as a market facilitator, and we bring our approaches in market systems development, or what we call inclusive markets, to bear in this project in Kakuma, just like we engage everywhere else in the world. So when we talk about a camp, a refugee camp in Kakuma, what we're really talking about in our context is a sprawl of camps. We've got kind of clusters of economic activity that naturally attract lots of suppliers and consumers. So we, as a market facilitator, we can kind of build on these ideas of economies of scale and network effects. So considering the level of complexity we have in this context, you know, the dynamism of markets in Kakuma, the kind of density of people and businesses, we feel that there are a lot of prerequisites already in place to deliver an inclusive markets project. So we can apply the principles of inclusive markets approaches. We act as a market facilitator. We can apply systems thinking and focus on this kind of sustainability and achieving scale and building on, you know, capacity incentives of these different permanent market actors. So, yeah, in other words, we apply the basic principles of market systems development approaches. Yeah, it's challenging. We've got these four thematic, these four themes that I'm going to talk about. So in the case of Kakuma, we've got this ongoing flux of refugees and migrants, which creates a lot of economic opportunities. Yeah, markets are evolving, they're shifting, but they're growing. There's a lot of increased cross-border trade, for example. And what happens is that this attracts lots of entrepreneurs from other parts of Kenya. People who have the ability to travel, for example, because many refugees don't in Kenya. But these entrepreneurs, they also bring with them lots of, business networks and contacts. So what we're seeing is this kind of symbiotic relationship between the refugee communities and the local people. And because of this kind of growth within this space, we're seeing lots of new businesses opening in Kakuma. For example, we've got a new branch of Equity Bank, of Kenya Commercial Bank. We've got many new banking agents, and most recently a new college campus that's opened. So this is really great for us because our project facilitates access to skills development and finance. Yeah, this is in support of business and employment opportunities. So with this growing number of actors there, we've got more people we can engage with. But surely, yeah, markets are still very thin, and many of these services are delivered by NGOs, sometimes still often wholly subsidized. So I think for us, it's really about how we engage with the few providers that do or can offer skills development services or financial services that can be geared towards our target beneficiaries. So for us, it's about kind of taking time to build the relationship and trust with project partners so that we can implement plans together that partners feel real ownership for, which means we have to know their interests and motivations first and foremost, and then we can kind of work together to test different kinds of products, different kinds of business models that are viable for the partner providers, but also relevant for the consumers. And I think sometimes it's about encouraging different kinds of service providers into this space, so working with them to, build quality services that are also cost effective. But of course it's difficult when there's still a lot of subsidy in this context, but there's definitely a willingness to change that, and we're really trying to build on that. So it's about us being really smart about how we use any subsidies, because we don't want to undermine the market. We want to build it. We don't want to undermine the private sector's ability to be able to compete. So talking about market diagnosis, we feel that yes, there is the basic prerequisites there for us to run an inclusive markets project in our chosen service sectors, despite the fact that there's a weak private sector and thin markets. But when you've got such shifting, unpredictable, often unstable markets, then market diagnosis is super, super important. For a start, we really need to understand the different interests and needs of our refugee communities versus the host beneficiaries. In this case, we've got refugees that are encamped, they have no travel documents, but yet on the other hand, they purchase a lot of services such as healthcare and schooling, and they receive a lot of remittances from outside. On average, every month there's something like $150,000 coming into the camps via mobile money transfer. On the other hand, you've got these pastoralist, local pastoralist communities from Kakuma who are seeing lots of more opportunities to diversify their incomes. They're engaging more and more in trading and owning property that they rent to refugees. And then within the wider system, we've got these other system actors. We've got the service providers that I've mentioned, and then we've got functions like local government. These guys are benefiting big time from revenues through to this economic growth, at the county level. So how all these actors engage with the markets, their roles, the relationships between them, all of this is something we really need to understand. So we have to talk with actors. We really need to know the constraints and opportunities that exist. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to fit our interventions to those real market issues. So moving on to this theme of market responsive interventions, we know from our project that even in these very thin but growing markets, we can take a systems view. We can design responsive interventions that deliver benefits to our target group. We look at the supply and demand of services like skills and finance where we are engaged, and we engage with these relevant actors to define issues, identify priority constraints, and design market-driven interventions. So in our case, we're facilitating the development, the delivery of integrated training in different ways by building the capacity of different kinds of training providers. But we don't deliver these services ourselves. We're partnering with local providers, whether they're public or private, and we're testing things. In this case, we're testing trade-based skills training coupled with life skills, entrepreneurship training, market literacy, financial literacy training. And then on the other stream, we're facilitating the development, delivery of financial services. We're collaborating with different kinds of financial institutions, commercial banks, savings and credit cooperatives, village and savings and lending associations. So for us, it's about engaging with lots of existing but also potential providers, devising, testing new business models, really new ways of doing business, and then sharing these experiences with a wider market. But of course, our biggest challenge are these traditional aid approaches that we butt up against, the direct service delivery that we're finding in a context like this, even though they are changing, yeah? But, you know, I kind of recognize that this is a big challenge for lots of humanitarian agencies because they don't necessarily have the capacities in place to adopt, you know, new, different kinds of approaches like market systems development approaches. So I think innovation is really the key to success when you're addressing thin markets. And innovation is the key when you're using subsidies to try and evolve rather than undermine a market. So we're endeavouring to engage with different kinds of actors, try new business models with our partners, and then, of course, building on our successes and, importantly, learning from the failures, because it's risky for all of us. So we've got to help our market-based partners to manage their risk, and often that means sharing their risk. So, for example, we assist providers to try new ways of delivering learning. So, like, we work with a model called learning groups, where we bring refugees together to learn in trade-based groups. We engage with different kinds of e-learning solutions. So we do a lot of work that supports research, that supports product development, even demand creation, but we don't subsidize the actual delivery of service. But I think for us, innovation, it's definitely more than just kind of getting the right partnerships and delivering the right services. It's about how we do things as a market facilitator. So this means finding ways to ensure that the market actors themselves are taking the lead, not the project. So we're seeing our role as temporary, this the kind of facilitation role where we stay outside of the market system. So we don't want to allow our actions to create dependency on this aid system. You know, it's trying to engage with market actors that have the incentive to make investments, whatever we mean by that and however big or small, and trying to work with as many different providers, public or private, as possible so we can promote as much competition as we can. And I also think I've heard mention adaptive management a couple of times, and I think, you know, MSD approaches help us to try and be more adaptable and flexible and not to be hemmed in too much by that log frame, although I think we all know how difficult that is. And it's also about trying to communicate beyond the boundaries of the project so that we're trying to demonstrate opportunities, encouraging, you know, other people to copy and replication to be made by the market. And maybe also it's about knowing when to kind of slow down or even stop doing things. So when you get a sense that new ways of working are becoming kind of routine within the market, or you're seeing some level of uptake or adoption by the market, you know, being able to kind of pull back. So I think for our project, I mean, we're definitely not there yet, but we've got quite a clear vision of how we think we need to work in this context, and a kind of clear vision of how we want the market for these training services and financial services to look in Kakuma in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ailsa. Thank you, Debora, Peter, and Collins. Very interesting. We have it's been so interesting that we've actually almost run out of time. We have about 10 minutes left for questions, and thank you for those of you who've been putting questions into the chat box already. Can I just get the ball rolling? I've got a couple of questions that we received in advance of the seminar. I'm going to throw them out to some of the speakers. Collins, are you still on the line? Collins?
I am right here.
Excellent. Collins, I had a couple of questions that are sort of connected, but essentially they're about what incentives are there for the private sector to enter this humanitarian space, and in particular, what are the incentives to get the private sector involved when the space is very distorted by handouts and other kinds of humanitarian actions that make it quite complicated for businesses to work?
Thank you. I think the only incentive that will drive private sector to go into this area is a profit incentive. If a program can demonstrate in advance that there is an opportunity that when exploited, a private sector will make money, then you got them hooked right from the beginning. The second incentive is that the private sector are always looking for opportunity to expand their market share. And because of that, they know nobody wants to go into this area. So those that are motivated enough are likely to work with you with the hope that once the program is over, they can have some form of infrastructure to enable them continue operating in those areas. Those are some very clear incentives that a program can build on. But critical is to demonstrate that there is a profit-making opportunity, and that is why in the market assessment, there should be very clear calculation of the margins they'll make if they are to operate in those areas. I think that is what we have discovered in the short time we have worked in northern Uganda. The fact that these areas are highly distorted should not be a surprise to anybody. Just like a normal business operating in a normal market, there is competition from people who are avoiding taxes, there is competition from people who are smuggling in goods. Any private sector that is willing to go in there, or any development actor that is willing to go in there, should be ready for this. That is where innovation, innovative delivery mechanisms, innovative transaction mechanisms that reduce transaction costs, innovative ways of mobilization that make the cost of mobilization lower. Those are the things that will easily make somebody realize that there is an opportunity to operate in such distorted markets.
Thank you. That was very very helpful, very succinct. Debora, what about refugees and displaced people who don't have land or any productive assets? I mean, we're talking about the poorest and most marginalized people affected. Are there any particular modalities for involving them in markets, or do they get left out by this process?
I mean, we have to remember that, you know, agricultural, commercial agriculture isn't the only way for people, you know, refugees or IDPs to make an income. So like in Swisscontact in northern Kenya, I mean, they weren't focused on that. They were focusing more on skills development. But in our case, where, you know, NU-TEC is an, you know, an agricultural project and we're focusing on agribusinesses, I mean, you know, getting refugees access to land is quite critical for us. We're working in a context where the Ugandan government is actually very generous with refugees and is allocating land to refugees. It's not a lot, it's only about an acre, and not every refugee has that, but it's something. And also we're quite, you know, the South Sudanese refugees who've come into northern Uganda are also farmers, so that also makes it a lot easier for us. Because there's, you know, for instance, we worked on sorghum and simsim last season, and, you know, the South Sudanese refugees, they've been growing simsim and sorghum for years. So it was quite easy for us to get them to do that. So there's a number of other things. But in terms of land, for those who haven't had land or those who've only had small plots of land, we've had to think innovatively. So what we've done is we're piloting a kind of a mechanization model right now in this season, where for every, for instance, 5 acres of land that refugees plow, so basically refugees are going and doing a deal with host community farmers. The host community farmers will get 1 acre plowed for free in exchange for lending or this land to the refugees, 5 acres of land. So we've just come up with this innovative model, and it's, we're in the beginning of it. We've got some really good indications that it's working. So it doesn't mean that that's the only thing. It just means of looking at your context and actually trying to come up with some different models. In other parts of the country, there's examples of leasing. There's examples of people paying back at the end of the season. I mean, I think what's critical is also that you have to make sure that the crops that refugees are planting are lucrative enough that they can actually factor in that cost of land in the end. So it's just looking at a number of these different models.
Mike, if you allow me just to add to that.
Please, Collins.
Right. We are already seeing a trend developing where the refugees are already renting land or leasing land from the local community, which means that there is a latent market in there that needs exploring. For instance, we are going to look at how can we actually demonstrate the value of land, the value of leasing land to the host communities, so that we can encourage transactions on land. Mm-hmm. But even more excitingly, I think it is important for us to actually understand how people in the host communities have used land in the past, quantifying how they have used it and monetizing the land that they are not using currently. That would actually trigger very exciting markets within the refugee hosting community.
Thank you, Collins. I've got a whole list of questions, and they keep coming in. So we're going to have to, unfortunately, bring it to a close very soon. But there's one topic that sort of keeps coming up, and I guess it's one that maybe you can speak to, Ailsa, which is about working in contexts where perhaps the policy environment is not so supportive of refugee livelihoods. Uganda has been a very positive example of a relatively strong supportive policy framework, but there are other markets where the policy frameworks actually exclude refugees from certain kinds of activity or certain kinds of resources. And I'm wondering if you've got any thoughts on that, on responding to that kind of environment.
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Very clearly, thank you.
So, well, I suppose firstly it depends on the goal of your project. I mean, in Kenya, we're not seeking permanent business and employment opportunities for refugees in this country. I mean, of course, we want them to improve their livelihoods in the camps while they're in the camps, and usually this is kind of via self-employment, income-generating opportunities. But we recognise that refugees move on to other countries and they return home. So we want to ensure in our project, we want to ensure that they improve their skills base so that they can engage in decent employment when they return or move on. In fact, we have a really great project in El Salvador that works to facilitate insertion of refugees into job markets. So it works with market actors to evaluate skills of refugees, links them to upskilling opportunities, then helps them profile them, present themselves to potential employees. I mean, it's a pilot, but it seems that now it's been so successful, it's been implemented as national policy. Thank you.
Well, that's a very positive note to end on, Ailsa. Thank you. Can I just say, so we do have to unfortunately close down the webinar now. Before you all leave, I would be extremely grateful if you could fill out our webinar survey. There's a link in the chat box. You just need to copy and paste that into your browser, and it'll take you no more than 30 seconds just to give us a little feedback on the seminar. You'll find a recording of this event on the Beam website in a few days' time on the address that's on the slide in front of you. Please do share this if you found it useful or interesting, please share it with your colleagues, your friends. And